We all crave unity in our families, at work, just in the world, right? But man, it is so hard to find. Today, we're going to dig into this really interesting idea from our source material. What if the secret to unity isn't some grand, complicated strategy? What if it all comes down to one simple personal quality: humility? Let's get into it.
So, our source kicks things off with this incredibly powerful call to action. I mean, that sets a pretty high bar, doesn't it? Being of one accord, of one mind. This isn't just about tolerating each other or getting along. It's about a deep, fundamental alignment. It's really the ultimate picture of what perfect unity could look like.
And this ideal, it isn't just some abstract thing. We all know it. In our families, our workplaces, our communities, we know there is incredible strength when people are truly united. We just instinctively look for it because, let's be honest, togetherness feels better and it just works better than being divided. Which, of course, brings us to the big question. If we all want unity so badly, why is it so incredibly elusive? Why do our best efforts to come together just fall apart, sometimes in a really spectacular way? It's a struggle we all know, for sure.
And this is where our source material just gets right to the heart of it. It says there's this gap, a gap between what we want and what we actually do. We know unity is good, but we still mess up. We stumble. And you know what? Acknowledging that shared struggle is exactly where our journey begins today.
So, let's get to the bottom of this. What's the root cause of all this division? Well, our source material traces it way, way back to a single ancient origin.
Now, here's where it gets really fascinating. According to the source, disunity didn't start because the system itself was broken. No, it all began in a perfect environment, a place of total harmony. That means the problem wasn't external, it was internal. It was just a single corrupting idea born from the pride and ambition of one individual.
Just think about that for a second. Think about how powerful that one idea must have been. A single seed of pride was apparently enough to completely shatter a perfect system and cause the first ever rift in the universe. That really shows us just how potent and personal the root of division is.
All right, so the next thing our source explains is how this cosmic conflict literally came down to Earth. The very same pattern of pride that caused that first rift, well, it found a foothold right here with us, with humanity.
And just look at how the pattern repeats itself. It starts with this feeling of discontent, not being happy with the way things are. Then that morphs into a desire to rise higher, to go beyond the boundaries that were set. And the result? Bam! The very first instance of human disunity, born from the exact same pride that started it all.
Okay, so we've diagnosed the problem, pride. It's the original source of division. But our text doesn't just leave us there, which is the good news. It proposes this incredibly powerful antidote, a direct countermeasure found in an amazing example of humility.
Now, to really get this antidote, we have to kind of reclaim a word we often get wrong. The source talks about the amazing condescension of Jesus. And in this context, condescension is not about looking down on people. It's the absolute opposite. It's the voluntary act of lowering oneself for the good of others, all motivated by love and service.
So here's the crucial point, the main takeaway. The source presents this incredible act of humility as the very foundation for unity. It's basically arguing that if pride is the thing that tears us apart, then this kind of active, selfless humility is the only thing that can truly bring us back together.
And this example isn't just a nice story. Our source says it's actually a practical guide. It gives us a whole new model for how to interact with each other, one that's based on service, not on status. It also completely redefines what power is, showing that true strength is in selflessness, not in self-promotion, which is a pretty radical idea today. And ultimately, it provides a direct roadmap for healing that very pride that tears us and our world apart.
So, after all that, what's the core takeaway here? After tracing the problem all the way back to pride, and then seeing the solution presented as humility, what's our path forward?
It really all boils down to this one simple but incredibly profound journey. The path away from disunity and toward real, lasting strength. It's the path from pride to humility. It's a total shift in our mindset from looking out for number one to putting others first. That's the core idea here.
It's one thing to understand this idea in theory, but the real question is, how do we actually live it out? In our day-to-day interactions, in our arguments, in our relationships, what does it actually look like to choose humility over pride? That's the real challenge, isn't it? And it's definitely something worth thinking about.
You ever wonder what makes a really great team, a tight-knit community, or even a family, just suddenly start to fall apart? Well, today we're going to dig into this ancient letter that's, believe it or not, a super modern case study on that exact problem. It's all about diagnosing the poisons that create conflict, and more importantly, it offers a blueprint for how to put things back together. All right, let's jump right in.
I mean, it's a universal question, right? Whether we're talking about the office, a sports team, or, hey, even just our personal relationships, we've all seen it happen. A group that was working so well together just gets consumed by friction and infighting. So what's really at the root of a breakdown like that?
So to get some answers, we're going to look at the Apostle Paul in a community he started way back in a city called Philippi. Now, this wasn't just some random group to him. He cared about these people deeply. I mean, he had a real strong personal connection. And the whole story really unfolds from his point of view because, well, he's just gotten some pretty troubling news.
And you could just feel the disappointment, can't you? The source material tells us this community, the one Paul had poured his heart and soul into, is now all tangled up in rivalry and contention. That harmony they once had? Gone, replaced by power struggles. But here's the thing about Paul. He wasn't someone who just complained about a problem. Nope, he was a diagnostician.
So he looked right past all the surface-level arguments and zeroed in on two really toxic mindsets that were fueling all this disunity. He basically saw them as the infection, the root cause that was making the whole community sick. So let's break down exactly what they were.
Okay, so the first problem he called out was selfish ambition. And the original Greek word for this, which is pretty interesting, is erythia. Now, this isn't just about being driven or wanting to succeed. No, it's a self-interested rivalry. Think about it like this. It's the mindset of that person who's willing to tear down their colleagues just to get ahead, Or the person who sees every single group project as just another chance for their own personal glory. It's that moment when your personal agenda totally overshadows the team's actual mission.
All right, the second toxic ingredient was conceit. And let's be super clear, this is not the same as confidence. Confidence is based on, actual ability. Conceit, though, the source material calls it a hollow pride, an empty arrogance. It's this inflated sense of your own importance that's not even based in reality. It's the kind of attitude that makes people want to pick fights and see everyone else as competition instead of a collaborator.
And look, make no mistake, the source material treats these attitudes with absolute seriousness. There's this quote from the book of James that just puts it so bluntly. Where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there. So we're not just talking about minor disagreements here. These are seen as fundamentally destructive forces.
So here's the bottom line. It's this direct pipeline from an internal attitude to total external chaos. The problem starts on the inside, right? With selfish ambition and conceit. And the effect? Well, it's inevitable. You get a community totally consumed by rivalry and contention. It's a really clear cause and effect.
But the good news is Paul doesn't just leave them with the bad news, with the diagnosis. Not at all. He offers a super clear prescription for healing, a practical, step-by-step blueprint for rebuilding that broken unity. And it all kicks off with a specific set of remedies.
So he lays out these 6 specific remedies, and you can almost think of them like the active ingredients for a healthy community. You've got consolation in Christ, the comfort of love, and then this fellowship of the Spirit. He talks about showing affection and compassion, adds mercy to the mix, and then wraps it up with the need for unity of mind and purpose. Every single one is a critical piece of the puzzle.
And this is really the end goal, right? What does a healed, thriving community actually look like? Well, Paul paints this amazing picture using 3 powerful phrases. First, having the same love. That's the foundation. Then, being of one accord, which is all about being in harmony, on the same page emotionally and spiritually. And finally, being of one mind. And that one's huge. It's the total opposite of that selfish, me-first mindset that caused all the problems. It's a picture of just profound unity.
But beyond this whole list of actions and good qualities, Paul points to one single core principle that makes everything else even possible. He's saying it's not just about the things you do, it's about how you think.
And here it is. This is the ultimate remedy. The core solution, according to Paul, is to adopt a very specific mindset, the exact same one he says that was in Christ Jesus. And what is that mindset? Well, it's one that's totally rooted in humility and in serving other people. He presents this as the direct antidote to that poison of selfish ambition and conceit. This is the key that unlocks real, genuine unity.
And so that leaves us with this really powerful question to think about, one that's just as relevant for you and me today as it was 2,000 years ago. In our teams, in our communities, in our own lives, What does it really mean to set aside our own selfish ambition and that hollow pride and actually put other people first?
You know that feeling, right? When a totally normal conversation just suddenly goes off the rails and turns into a full-blown fight. Well, in this explainer, we're going to dig into what's really going on in those moments, and we're going to uncover a pretty surprising way to find some common ground.
I mean, we've all been there. One minute you're talking about where to get dinner, the next you're in a heated debate, and you're just left thinking, how on earth did we get here? We usually blame the topic, or maybe we think the other person is just being stubborn. But what if the real reason for the fight is hiding in plain sight?
Yeah, our first instinct is to look at the external stuff. The words that were said, who said what, all of that. But the sources for this explainer suggest that the real root of our conflicts, the real problem, is actually way deeper than that. We've got to look inward.
All right, so let's get into it. Section 1, the anatomy of an argument. First, we need to really dissect what's happening when we argue. Because, it's so much more than just a couple of different opinions clashing.
When an argument kicks off, we're almost always reacting to what we can see and hear, the person's tone of voice, the words they're using, their body language. But the big idea here is that all of that, it's just the tip of the iceberg. The real engine driving the whole conflict is what's going on beneath the surface. All those thoughts and feelings swirling around inside.
So, Section 2, the real source of conflict. If what we say and do isn't the actual root cause, then what is? Let's zero in on where the problem really starts.
So this chart really lays it all out. On the left, you have what we normally focus on, right? The outward stuff, what was said or done. But the material we're looking at says, nope, the real action is on the right side. It's our inner world, our thoughts, our feelings, basically the entire state of our heart and mind before we even open our mouths.
And this is such a powerful way to think about it. The source uses this quote from Jesus to make a really critical point. Our actions, our words, they don't just happen in a vacuum. They are the direct result of what's already brewing inside of us. So the fight we see on the outside is really just a symptom of a much deeper internal problem.
This one really hammers it home, doesn't it? Whatever is filling up our hearts and our minds is eventually going to spill out of our mouths. It's inevitable. If our heart is full of pride or anger, well, that's what our words are going to be full of too, no matter how hard we try to dress them up. That is the real source of the argument.
Okay, Section 3, a practical guide to humility. So if the problem starts on the inside, it only makes sense that the solution has to start there too. And this brings us to humility, not as some fuzzy, abstract idea, but as a practical, step-by-step guide.
Okay, so it's one thing to know what the problem is, but what are we supposed to do about it? How do we fix it? Well, the source material actually gives us a really clear roadmap for how to start reshaping that inner state we've been talking about.
So this path to unity gets broken down into 3 pretty clear steps. Step 1 is adopting a lowliness of mind, which is really just a way of saying deep, genuine humility. Step 2, consciously choose to value others more highly than ourselves. And finally, step 3, we have to shift our focus from what do I want to what do they need. These are the fundamental principles that start to change everything on the inside.
And one of the very first, most powerful ways this whole mindset shift shows up is in the way we listen. Think about it. Listening is usually the first thing to completely break down in an argument, which means it's probably the most important thing we need to fix.
And this is the key practice right here, active listening. This is not just about being quiet while someone else talks. It's a total mental pivot. You stop planning your brilliant comeback and you put all of your energy into one goal, truly, deeply understanding where the other person is coming from.
So let's break this down. Poor listening, that's our default mode, isn't it? We're just reloading, waiting for our turn to fire back. But active listening is a conscious decision to go for understanding instead. And get this, the goal isn't even to agree. The goal is just to build enough trust and communication to keep the conversation from exploding. That right there can change everything.
All right, Section 4, the unseen unifier. Now, this is where it gets even more interesting. The source material suggests that our own hard work isn't the only thing at play here. It seems there's an unseen force that helps in this whole process.
So according to the Apostle Paul, who's quoted here, real unity isn't just a byproduct of good people using good communication skills. It's described as something more, a kind of deep harmony that's actually produced by the Holy Spirit, which then creates a peace that binds us together. It's like there's an external power helping our internal change.
And building on that spiritual side of things, the source also points out that this unity gets even stronger when people share a common faith and understanding. When a group of people are already on the same page about the big things in life, it gives them a really solid foundation for working through the smaller disagreements.
And that brings us to our final section, Section 5, a question for yourself. We've gone from what an argument is to how to fix it with practical tools and even a spiritual element. And now it all comes down to one final, really challenging thought.
When you take all these pieces, the humility, valuing others, looking out for their interests, and you put them all together, what you're really talking about is a profound idea, a kind of death to self. It means actively choosing to set aside our ego, our constant need to be right, and our own agenda, all for the sake of the relationship, for the sake of unity.
So this is the big question to leave you with. And it's not just for the sake of conversation. Seriously, take a second and actually imagine it. What would your family look like? Your friendships? Your workplace? What would our communities look like if this was the starting point for every single one of our interactions? That's a powerful thought to take with you.
Hey, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a concept that has, well, stumped and fascinated theologians for centuries. It's called the mystery of godliness. And it's an idea that really pushes the limits of our understanding and asks us to think about what seems impossible. So, let's get into it.
I think the best place to start is with this quote from the Apostle Paul. It's just a perfect reminder of the kind of humility we need for today's topic. Because when you're talking about something as huge as the nature of God, you gotta start by admitting, we're never gonna have the full picture. And that leads us right into our first section here. The whole point is that some subjects, especially when you're talking about eternal things, they're just so massive that our learning journey is, well, it's endless. There's always more to discover. And just to give you a sense of the scale we're dealing with, think about this. The source material we're looking at suggests that even if we had all of eternity, we would still never get to the bottom of Christ's condescension. His choice to become human. Why? Because it's a complete paradox. The infinite becoming finite. That's just how deep this thing runs. So right at the center of this endless topic is something that you can only describe as a mind-boggling mystery. It's something that just completely challenges our basic understanding of what's even possible. So here it is. This is the big question. How could a being that's infinite and eternal become a finite human, bound by time, by space, and even by death? It's a question that honestly seems to break all the rules of the universe as we know it. And right here, Scripture actually gives this idea a name, the mystery of godliness. This is the theological idea for how the divine Son of God could also be a divine human being, holding both of those natures at the same time. By its very definition, it's called a mystery for a reason. But, okay, while it is a mystery, it's not like we're just left to wonder about it with no help. The source material points us towards Scripture for a deeper look, and it really zooms in on what's called the Great Condensation. And it turns out that in what many scholars think is a beautiful, early Christian hymn, it's found in Philippians chapter 2, we get one of the absolute richest explanations of this act. It's almost like a poem that maps out this incredible journey of self-humbling. So let's actually unpack that passage. We're going to trace this unbelievable path from the highest possible place in the universe all the way down to the most humble, from God to a servant. Okay, so this Philippians hymn, it basically breaks down this process into 4 clear acts. First, it says Jesus existed in the form of God. Second, that he emptied himself. Third, that he humbled himself. And then finally, that his obedience took him all the way to death on a cross. So let's dig into what a couple of these really mean. Now, this is where it gets really fascinating, just the choice of words here. The original Greek word for form is morphe. And that doesn't just mean what something looks like on the outside. It means the very essence, the core nature of a thing. So when the text says Jesus was in the form of God, it's making a huge statement, that he shared the actual nature of God, that he was his equal. And that third step, he humbled himself, becomes so much more powerful when you see the contrast the source material draws. You have the traditional story of Lucifer, which is all about aiming for supremacy, about grabbing for more power. But Jesus' path, it was the exact polar opposite. He willingly went from having universal supremacy to becoming a total servant. It's a really stark difference. In this whole journey of humbling himself, it hits its absolute climax in that final act mentioned in the hymn, the cross. And this wasn't just how the story ended.
It was the ultimate expression of surrender. It was the whole point of the condescension. So the thing to get here is that the cross was a deliberate choice. Back then, it was the most shameful, most humiliating way to die. The source explains this was no accident. It was planned in what Scripture calls the counsel of peace, and it was even foreshadowed way back in the Old Testament. And the ultimate goal? It was so that he could, as the Apostle Paul put it, become sin for us, opening up a way for humanity to be reconnected with God. And all of this brings us to our last and maybe the most important question. The source material really suggests this isn't just a bunch of theological facts to know. It's supposed to be an example to live by. And it asks us to think about this. How can reflecting on this ultimate act of surrender inspire that same kind of humility in our own lives? It's a deep question, and it really shows that the mystery of godliness isn't just about trying to understand God, but maybe it's about transforming ourselves. So, what does it really mean to be truly great? Today, we're going to explore a mindset that, well, it pretty much flips everything we think we know about power and status completely on its head. It's a really deep, kind of counterintuitive idea, so let's just dive right in. I am the greatest. You've heard it a million times, right? The one and only Muhammad Ali. And look, his confidence was a huge part of his power. It defined this model of greatness. It's all about self-proclamation, about being the best. But the source material we're looking at today, it presents a radically different alternative to that whole idea. So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll put these two models of greatness right next to each other, head to head. Then, we're going to get into what our source calls the ultimate humble example, and we'll unpack a really key text from the book of Philippians to do that. After that, we'll talk about what this sacrifice actually means, and maybe most importantly, how we can even begin to apply this principle in our own lives today. All right, so let's get into it. We've got these two totally opposing models. On one side, you have greatness through self-exaltation. Think Muhammad Ali. But on the other side, you have a model based on something completely different, humility. Let's really see what that looks like. And this is it. This is the core conflict right here. You've got one worldview that shouts, I am the greatest. And then you have this other one, this idea of the mind of Christ, which isn't about lifting yourself up at all. It's actually defined by humbling yourself for other people. I mean, you can't get more opposite than that, right? They're total polar opposites. Okay, so what does this humble model of greatness even look like in the real world? In practice? Well, our source points us to Jesus as the ultimate counterexample. And get this, he's not just presented as a humble person, but as a perfect one. And that makes what he does next even more mind-blowing. Look, to really get the depth of this humility, you've got to understand the starting point. According to the source, Jesus was perfectly sinless. I mean, tempted in every way, just like we are, but he never sinned. Not once, not even a thought. He was always in lockstep with the Father's will. And this perfection, it's the absolute key to understanding the sacrifice that's coming. And this is where it gets really interesting, kind of paradoxical, actually. Even though he was already perfect, the text says he learned obedience by suffering. Think about that. For him, this wasn't just some theory or abstract idea. No, it was a path he chose to walk, a process he actually went through and endured. Okay, this brings us right to the heart of what we're talking about today. It's a passage from Philippians chapter 2. And, a lot of scholars see this as one of the most powerful, maybe even one of the most beautiful texts in the entire Bible. And what it describes is this radical journey downwards, a journey of descent. So let's trace this journey step by step. It starts at the absolute pinnacle of greatness, being equal with God. Can't get higher than that. But from there, it's just this shocking fall. First, he becomes a bondservant. Then he's made in human likeness. And finally, in the ultimate act of humility, he doesn't just die. He accepts the most humiliating death you could imagine at the time, the death of a criminal on a cross. Now, it's really easy to just kind of read past that word bondservant, but we can't. It is absolutely crucial. The original Greek word is doulos, and it literally means a slave. So we're not just talking about accepting a lower-paying job here. This was willingly taking on the lowest possible status in that society, a total 180-degree reversal of power. But why, right? What was the point of all of this? What was the purpose of this incredible, unbelievable act of self-humbling? Well, that's what we're going to get into next, the deep theological meaning behind the sacrifice. The Apostle Paul, He puts it this way in another one of his letters. He became a curse for us. I mean, that language is intense. It's not just flowery words. It implies he took on the full weight, the full consequence of all of humanity's wrongdoing and just absorbed it completely. And all of this, it leads to this central, honestly mind-bending idea from our source material. The creator of the entire universe died on a cross to become our Redeemer. Just let that sink in for a second. The one who made everything willingly died for the sake of the very things he created. Okay, so that's the theology. And it's huge, it's profound. But what does it mean for you and me, for us, just living our lives today? How on earth do we take a principle this big and actually apply it? Well, what's interesting is that Jesus taught this very principle directly. He flat out said, "The greatest among you will be your servant." It's that same upside-down logic we've been talking about. If you lift yourself up, you'll be brought down. But if you humble yourself, you'll be lifted up. See? It's the exact same pattern we saw back in Philippians. And Paul really boils it all down to this super practical instruction right in the same chapter. He says, "Do nothing through selfish ambition or conceit." That is the day-to-day application of the mind of Christ. It's all about our motives, right? It's about stopping and checking why we're really doing what we're doing. And this brings us to a really crucial point. The source material kind of forces us to ask some pretty deep questions. And the first one sounds simple, but it's incredibly profound. When you see this incredible act of humility and sacrifice, how are you even supposed to respond to that? Which, of course, leads to the next question, which goes even deeper. What response could possibly be adequate? I mean, really think about the scale of what we've just talked about, from being equal with God all the way down to a Roman cross. What could any of us possibly do that would even begin to measure up to that? And this tees up a question that really challenges a common human instinct, right? The instinct to do something, to earn our keep. The question is, why is it so wrong to think that our own good works, our efforts, can add anything to what Christ has already done? The source material seems to suggest that the sacrifice was complete, finished, all by itself. And so we kind of end up right back where we started, but with a totally new perspective. We kicked this all off with "I am the greatest." We've walked through this other model that says the greatest one became the absolute least. So the final question, the one I want to leave with you to really think about, is this. If true greatness isn't about exalting yourself, then what does it actually mean to be great? All right, let's dive in. Today we're digging into a really fascinating text that sets up this huge battle for our minds by asking a pretty wild question. Are we talking about a mind implant, or is the real issue something that needs mind surgery? Right off the bat, this question, it sounds like it's ripped straight from a sci-fi movie, doesn't it? But what the source material is doing here is using this really strong metaphor to get us thinking about something much closer to home, how our thoughts are being shaped every single day. And look, this isn't just some far-off idea. The text actually grounds this whole conversation in what's happening right now. I mean, right at this moment, companies are sinking tons of money into developing brain-computer interfaces, pushing this whole concept from science fiction into actual fact. So you've got this technology that's, well, it's a double-edged sword, really. On the one hand, you have this amazing potential to help people with conditions like epilepsy or Parkinson's. But then the text brings up this pretty chilling question. If we can influence the brain for good, what's to stop someone from using it for something sinister like mind control? Okay, but here's where the whole argument takes a really important turn. The text is basically saying, hey, maybe we're worried about the wrong thing, or at least not the only thing. It's suggesting that there's a much quieter, sneakier kind of mind control that's already happening all around us. And this right here, this lays out the central idea perfectly. It's putting these two things side by side. The sci-fi idea of a physical implant versus the everyday reality of being, you could say, programmed by the flood of media we're swimming in. So it's not one single chip in your brain. It's more like this constant drip, drip, drip of influence. Yeah, and this quote really nails how this cultural programming is supposed to work. It's all about immersion. The idea is that when you're just soaked in media all the time, the way the world thinks starts to leave its mark on you, kind of like a stamp on your mind, and you slowly start to think the same way. So the text frames this whole thing as a choice between two very different kinds of influence. Drawing on the book of 1 Corinthians, you've got what it calls the spirit of the world. That's kind of the background noise, the default way of thinking you just absorb from culture. And then on the other side, it offers this alternative, the spirit of God. And that brings us to a really personal point. The source basically stops and asks you to think about your own life with these questions. With these two big influences out there, who's actually your teacher from day to day? And what are you learning, whether you realize it or not? But the argument doesn't stop there. It actually goes a layer deeper. The text says that just trying to manage all this outside noise isn't going to cut it. Why? Because the real problem isn't just in our minds. It goes way deeper, down to what it calls the human heart. Now, this is a really key distinction the text makes. You can change your mind about something, you can decide to think differently, change your opinion, but the heart, we're talking about your core desires, who you fundamentally are. The text argues you can't change that by yourself. It's just not something we can do on our own. So why can't we just fix our own hearts? What's the deal? Well, the text points us to this passage from Jeremiah. And the claim is that our hearts have this built-in flaw. They're deceptive. They trick us. You can't really trust them to give you an accurate picture of reality or even of yourself. And this is pretty cool. If you look at the original language, you get this amazing picture. The Hebrew word is a'akov, and it literally means like bumpy, uneven ground, the kind of ground that's going to trip you up. So it's this really vivid metaphor, right? Our heart is like this treacherous terrain that leads our thoughts down these twisted, crooked paths. Okay, so here's the bottom line it's building to. If the core problem is a tricky, deceptive heart that we can't fix ourselves, then the solution has to come from somewhere else. I mean, you can't exactly perform surgery on yourself, can you? And that brings us full circle, right back to the title of this whole thing. Instead of some sci-fi mind implant, the source offers this very different metaphor, a divine heart surgery. It's not about adding a new piece of technology. It's about fixing something that's broken at the very core. So how is this surgery supposed to work? What does it look like? The text actually breaks it down for us pretty clearly. First, the surgeon is the Holy Spirit. The tool isn't a scalpel. It's the sword of the Spirit, which is identified as the Word of God. And the goal? It's all about precision, getting in there and figuring out the real thoughts and intentions of the heart. But this isn't something that just happens to you. The text is really clear that this divine operation comes with our own active personal responsibility. It's like this surgery opens the door for change, but then we have to actually walk through it and keep walking. And that responsibility is summed up perfectly in this phrase from Romans, to be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So the idea is, once the heart is dealt with, you have to actively retrain your mind. It's not a one-and-done deal. It's this ongoing process. Which, of course, leads to the big practical question, right? If we're supposed to be renewing our minds, what does that actually mean? Like, what do we do? Well, the source gives a very specific guide. It points to this list from Philippians. Renewing your mind is all about focus. It's about deliberately choosing to fill your thoughts with these kinds of things, whatever is true, noble, just, pure, lovely, and so on. You could think of it as the mental diet you need for a healthy, renewed mind. And that's really where the text leaves us. It's a challenge that feels honestly more relevant than ever in our world of nonstop information. Because the real choice isn't about getting a mind implant. It's about this idea of a heart surgery, and then making a choice every single day about what we allow to shape our minds. So, in a world where you're constantly being bombarded with input, what are you choosing to focus on? All right, let's dive right in. We're going to explore a concept we all think we've got a pretty good handle on, love. But what if the love we're all familiar with, what if it's just the very beginning? What if there's a version of love out there so vast, so huge that it's literally immeasurable? Let's kick things off with a question just to get us in the right frame of mind. Seriously, before we go any further, just take a second and think about that. What does that love feel like? Who is it from? Try to get a really clear picture in your head, because we're going to use that as our starting point for a journey into something, well, something infinitely bigger. So, the text we're digging into today presents this incredibly powerful metaphor. It suggests that all the love we've ever known, all those moments of human tenderness, they're like a tiny rill, just a small stream. But in contrast, the divine love it's talking about is a boundless ocean. We're not just talking about more love here, we're talking about a completely different scale of existence. Okay, so that immediately begs the question, right? How in the world do you even begin to wrap your head around an ocean when all you've ever known is a stream? How can our finite minds ever possibly grasp something that's infinite? Well, the text we're drawing from actually outlines a surprisingly intense way to try. According to our source, this is not some casual hobby. It suggests you should be meditating on it every single day, diligently searching the scriptures to understand it. And this one is key, summoning every power and capability you have. This is an all-in kind of effort, using every single part of your being to just try and comprehend this love. So you do all that, you dedicate your life, your mind, every capability you have to this one single task. And there it is. That's the punchline. The most crucial point is that even after all of that incredible effort, you've really only just begun. You reach the absolute limit of your understanding. You look up, and you realize there is still an infinity stretching out beyond you. It's a pursuit that has no finish line. This leads to a really fascinating paradox. If you can never fully get there, if you can't reach the destination of complete knowledge, what does the journey itself actually do to you? How does trying to understand something infinite fundamentally change who you are? We usually associate learning a lot about something with a sense of accomplishment, right? Maybe even a little bit of pride. You study hard, you learn a ton, you start to feel like an expert. But the text we're looking at completely flips that idea on its head, especially when the subject you're studying is infinite. It specifically warns against becoming puffed up, and this is such a brilliant way to put it, isn't it? It's that false feeling that you've reached the end of the road, that you can have this exalted opinion of yourself because you think you've learned everything there is to know. But like we just saw, with a subject that's literally infinite, that's just impossible. Instead, the text offers this incredibly powerful alternative. It argues that true learning on this topic actually leads to meekness. And this isn't about weakness, it's a deep lowliness of mind. Basically, the more you learn about that boundless ocean, the more you realize how much you don't know, the more aware you become of just how small you are in comparison. So the result of this whole pursuit isn't pride, it's a deep and lasting humility. So we have this profound internal shift happening. Going after infinite knowledge actually leads to humility. But this isn't just some philosophical idea to think about. The text argues that this internal change has a very real, very practical external result. Let's see how this personal humility actually becomes the foundation for building a community. The source material gets right to the point with this question. It knows that disunity is a real-world problem. And we all know this, right? In our communities, at work, even in our own families. People have different opinions, different goals, and, well, conflict happens. And here it is. This is where it all connects. The solution it offers is that the only real path to unity is paved with humility. It's about consciously rejecting that puffed-up feeling of self-importance. I mean, after all, if your entire perspective is fixed on an infinite ocean of love, how can you possibly hang on to selfish ambition or conceit? That deep sense of smallness we were just talking about, that becomes the very thing that builds a bridge to other people. So, as we start to wrap this up, I think the biggest takeaway is this. This isn't a topic you just master and then move on from. It's not a class you can pass. It's a fundamental shift in how you see everything. It is truly an endless exploration. This timeline just beautifully shows the ever-expanding scale of this whole thing. It starts small, with a daily practice. That practice then grows into a whole lifetime of study. But even a lifetime isn't nearly enough. The text says you could study this love for ages upon ages, throughout eternity itself, and you would still only be scratching the surface. And that's the final, truly mind-bending idea. Not even an eternity is long enough to fully uncover the depths of this love. It is, by its very nature, inexhaustible. The more you explore it, the more there is to discover. It just keeps going. So we end up right back where we started, but hopefully with a totally new perspective. This was never about finding a final answer. It's about embracing the journey. It's about growing a kind of humility that builds unity and a curiosity that can literally last forever. So the only question left to ask is, what's your next step? What if I told you that the secret to making your money last forever wasn't discovered by some Wall Street genius, but by an 11-year-old boy? You know that feeling, right? Payday hits, you feel rich for a solid 10 minutes, and then, poof, it's just gone. Where does it all go? Well, this story is about a really weird, counterintuitive solution to that exact problem.
So let's set the scene. We're not in a fancy boardroom or a high-tech trading room. Nope. Our story starts with a young boy and the simple, happy sound of a few coins jingling around in his pocket. Okay, so this is Alvin. He's 11 years old, living in Kisumu, Kenya. And his world? It's pretty straightforward, you know? It's all about those small, immediate joys that make being a kid awesome. Yeah, for Alvin, being rich wasn't about big bank accounts. It was about that satisfying jingle in his pocket on the walk home. It meant he had the freedom to buy some crunchy nuts or a cold ice cream. And in his mind, that's what money was for, period. It was his. But then, one day, a simple lesson in his Bible class was about to completely flip his whole world, and his relationship with that pocket money totally upside down. His teacher's words were super direct, and for Alvin, kind of shocking. I mean, he already gave money at church, sure, but that was different. That was money his dad gave him specifically for the offering plate. What his teacher was suggesting was something else entirely. And this was the key, right here. The teacher explained that giving his dad's money, well, that was kind of like being a delivery boy. She said the real giving, the kind that truly counts, had to come from his own pocket. It had to be a real sacrifice, giving up something he could have had for himself. And boom! Just like that, Alvin's simple world got complicated. Suddenly, every single coin in his pocket wasn't just his to spend anymore. Each one represented a choice. Nuts and ice cream for him, or this new, challenging idea of giving. Now, you know how it is. It's one thing to hear a good idea, but actually doing it, that's a whole different story. And for Alvin, it was about to get really frustrating. At first, his reaction was pretty normal. He felt kind of called out, a little defensive. But he just couldn't shake her words. And deep down, he had that nagging feeling. Okay, maybe she's got a point. So, reluctantly, he decided he would at least try. But man, trying was way harder than he thought. The very first week, his plan to save completely crumbled in the face of a tasty snack. A month later, he tried again and failed again. For 2 whole months, it was this same frustrating cycle, and he just felt defeated. The goal just couldn't compete with the promise of a treat that was right there in front of him. And then, after 2 months of failing, something totally random happened. It involved his brother, an ice cream, and one single coin that changed everything. It all came down to this little guy. A single 20-shilling coin. We're talking what, like 20 US cents? Not much, right? But this one coin, just sitting in Alvin's pocket as he walked home one afternoon, was about to become the most important coin of his life. So there he is, walking with his older brother Alan. He's got the coin, and he's got his sights set on some ice cream. He's literally about to repeat the exact same spending pattern he's been stuck in for months. But this time, something was different. It was his brother. Alan just flat out refused. It wasn't some big, deep moral lesson. It was just a typical older brother comment. Alvin was annoyed for sure, but he couldn't really argue. And so, just like that, he put the coin back in his pocket and didn't buy the ice cream. That little kind of frustrating moment had this huge, totally unexpected consequence. It was the beginning of his big breakthrough. So fast forward to the weekend. It's Sabbath, and guess what's still sitting in Alvin's pocket? That same 20-shilling coin. And for the very first time, Alvin walked up to that offering plate and put in money that was truly his, money that he had actually sacrificed for. He had wanted something, and he'd given it up. And this is the crazy part. This was his big aha moment. He expected to feel the loss of that ice cream, right? To feel like he'd missed out. But he didn't. Instead, the feeling of finally giving his own money, it was powerful. It felt like a victory, not a loss. And that one good feeling, that's all it took to break the cycle. It felt so rewarding that the very next week, he intentionally saved 20 shillings again. And the week after that, it quickly became his new habit, a non-negotiable part of his week. And this is where things get really weird, in the best way possible. A total paradox. Think about it. Before, when Alvin tried to hoard every last coin for himself, he was always broke. But now, by committing to give away the first part of his money, he somehow always had enough. In fact, it was more than enough. By making that 20 shillings a priority, his whole mindset shifted. He became way more conscious of his other spending. And to his surprise, he often had extra money left over at the end of the week, money he started giving to his father to save for him. Of course, the temptation for nuts and ice cream doesn't just disappear overnight. He's still a kid, but now he has a new way of thinking about it. He has this little mantra he uses to weigh his immediate desires against that bigger, better feeling he gets from giving. Ultimately, Alvin's story is about so much more than just pocket money. It's this powerful lesson in a truth that seems backwards, that setting aside the first piece, instead of trying to save what's left over, can completely change our relationship with everything we have. It proves that by giving first, we can unlock this surprising sense of abundance. So that kind of leaves us with a question, doesn't it? What's the one small first fruit in our own lives that we could set aside to gain something way bigger in return? All right, let's jump right in. We talk all the time about unity, right? In our communities, at work, with our families. It's this thing we're all striving for. But what if? What if the best blueprint for how to actually get there was written down almost 2,000 years ago? Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today, a really profound model for unity from a very old letter. I mean, it's a question that's as old as time, isn't it? How on earth do you get a bunch of different people, all with their own ideas, their own wants, to come together in real, actual harmony? Is there some kind of secret sauce for it? Well, according to the text we're looking at, the answer is a big, resounding yes. And you'll find it in a place you might not expect, the second chapter of the Apostle Paul's letter to the Philippians. And we're not talking about some vague, feel-good idea here. No, this is laid out as a detailed, step-by-step blueprint for how believers can find that true unity. So what exactly is this blueprint? Well, the text tells us that to even begin to understand unity between people, we've got to look higher first. We have to start with a divine model. Okay, and this is where it really starts to click into place. The core idea, the absolute foundation of this blueprint, is that the ultimate example of unity is the relationship inside what theologians call the Godhead. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Their eternal, loving, totally harmonious relationship, that is presented as the perfect pattern for us to try and follow. And the text isn't just pulling this idea out of thin air either. It's grounded in other scriptures. The source points us to passages that talk about this incredible deep unity, between the Father and the Son, and then between the Son and the Holy Spirit. It paints a picture of this perfect, unbreakable bond. Okay, so we've got this incredible divine model, but the text is super clear on this next point. This isn't just some beautiful idea to put in a glass case and admire. Nope. It's presented as a fundamental responsibility, a core duty for every single follower. And this is a really crucial point. This stuff isn't optional. It's not some kind of extra credit for the super spiritual. According to the source, living in unity and showing love aren't just suggestions. They're the expected baseline behaviors of a Christian. It completely reframes unity. It's not a nice to have, it's an absolute must-have. It's a core part of what it means to live out your faith. And you can really feel how seriously the author, Paul, took this. In another one of his letters, he's not just asking nicely or suggesting it. He pleads with them. He's begging them, let there be no divisions among you. He wants them to be perfectly joined together. I mean, you can just feel the urgency in those words. It's powerful stuff. And this wasn't just a one-off idea he had. The source makes it really clear that this theme of unity is woven through so many of Paul's writings. It's one of his big, central, most consistent messages for sure. All right, so we've got the what, it's this divine model, and we've got the why, it's a fundamental responsibility, but that leads to the biggest question of all, right? The how. How in the world are we supposed to actually do this? How do we achieve this kind of unity in our messy, complicated, real lives? Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because it's one thing to talk about a goal, but it's a whole other thing to have a practical roadmap to actually get there. Well, the text explains that the path isn't about a list of rules to follow. It's about cultivating a very specific mindset, a certain way of thinking. It's an inside job first, before it ever shows up on the outside. And what is that mindset? It's all about humility, putting others first out of love, and submitting to God, and the whole thing is modeled directly on Christ himself. So we can actually break this down into 3 really practical steps. Step 1, embrace humility. Like, really embrace it. Step 2, make a conscious choice to put others first, their needs, their interests ahead of your own. And step 3, always, always be looking to that supreme model for your example. See, these aren't just some fuzzy, abstract ideas.
They're laid out as the practical, day in, day out nuts and bolts of how you build real unity. And that brings us to the absolute peak of this whole teaching, the main event. What is that supreme model? Who is the ultimate, perfect example of this mindset in action? The answer, the text tells us, is wrapped up in one single, incredibly powerful idea: the condescension of Christ. That is the ultimate demonstration of humility. That is the ultimate act of putting others first. Now, condescension? That's a big word. And today, we usually think of it in a negative way, right? But in this theological context, it means something profound. So, what does it truly mean here? Let's unpack that a bit. Right off the bat, the source is clear. What we're talking about now isn't something you can just neatly fit into a box or draw on a whiteboard. It's presented as a deep, an unfathomable mystery. So what is it? At its very core, it's this: the infinite God choosing to become a finite man. The one who is limitless choosing to accept limits. The Creator stepping down into his own creation. I mean, think about that. That is the ultimate act of humility. It's the ultimate example of prioritizing others, bar none. And again, the source material really hammers this point home. It says that our human, finite minds, we just can't fully get our heads around the sheer scale of this. It's an infinite act. We can think about it, we can be inspired by it, we can let it guide us, but we can never fully, completely understand it. At the end of the day, it's a mystery. So, that leaves us with a pretty massive, challenging question, doesn't it? If the ultimate blueprint for our unity is based on an infinite mystery that we can't even fully comprehend, then how are we supposed to let that guide our very finite, very real, day-to-day lives, our actions, our relationships? How does the infinite guide the everyday? And that's both the challenge and the incredible invitation that this ancient blueprint leaves us with.
Have you ever wondered what the secret is to real, genuine unity? I'm not just talking about, getting along on the surface. I mean being truly, deeply connected. Well, today we're going to dig into this powerful, almost radical blueprint for togetherness that we find in the Bible. So, let's jump right in.
Here's what we've got lined up. We'll start with this amazing metaphor for unity, then we'll look at the one thing that just threatens to tear it all apart. After that, we're going to discover the antidote, check out the ultimate example to follow, and finally, we'll try to unpack the profound mystery that's sitting at the heart of this whole idea.
All right, so let's start with a really vivid, practical image, one that just perfectly captures the ideal of what this kind of community is supposed to look like.
Wow. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. This isn't just about being friendly, right? This is about life or death interdependence. When one person stumbles, the whole group has to work together to make sure they're secure. This whole idea of being roped together, that's the standard. So what threatens to cut that rope?
Well, the Apostle Paul, he was so keenly aware of the dangers to this unity. And he pinpointed these really specific attitudes that act just like a knife, fraying the very rope that's meant to hold a community together.
Paul draws such a clear line in the sand here. It's like night and day. On one side, you've got selfish ambition and conceit, total unity killers. But on the other, you have this rich atmosphere of comfort, love, and mercy. These are the things that make the rope of unity stronger. And believe me, Paul gets even more specific, using particular Greek words to diagnose the problem with, like, surgical precision.
Okay, so the first word is aletheia. Now, this isn't just about having goals or wanting to succeed. No, this is about rivalry. It's that drive to get ahead, even if it's at the expense of other people. Paul actually lists this in his catalogs of sins because he knew that the second our ambition becomes all about me instead of we, the harmony is just shattered.
And that brings us to the second word, kenodoxia. This one means conceit or vainglory. But here's what's so fascinating about it. This word appears only once in the entire New Testament, right here. The fact that Paul uses it so uniquely really drives home the danger of an inflated ego. It's a warning against self-centeredness that is so critical, he literally had to use a special term for it.
So, if selfish ambition and conceit are the poison, then what's the antidote? See, Paul doesn't just point out the problem, he gives us a really clear prescription for the cure.
His counterproposal is this attitude he calls lowliness of mind. It is the absolute, complete opposite of rivalry and vainglory. It's a fundamental shift away from focusing on ourselves and turning our focus toward other people. But what does that actually look like day to day?
And Paul, he doesn't leave us guessing.
He breaks this down into two incredibly practical and, let's be honest, pretty challenging actions. First, you esteem others as more important than yourself. And second, you actively look out for their interests, not just your own. This isn't some passive feeling. It's an active, intentional choice you have to make.
But Paul also knows that just giving instructions, well, it's not always enough, is it? We need a model. We need to see what this lowliness of mind actually looks like when it's lived out perfectly. So he points us to the ultimate example, Jesus Christ himself.
Now, before we see the example, it's really important to understand this key word Paul uses here, phreni. He uses this root word over and over because he's not just talking about some random feeling or a one-off action. He is calling for a specific mindset, a deliberate, thought-out way of approaching the world. It's all about cultivating a Christ-like way of thinking.
And here's where we see that mindset in action, step by step. First, Jesus was fully aware of his divine identity. His humility didn't come from a place of low self-worth. Second, from that position of ultimate authority, he willingly emptied himself, choosing to take the form of a servant. And finally, he humbled himself even further, becoming obedient all the way to death on a cross. This is the pattern we're called to follow.
So what's the bottom line here? Ultimately, this Christ-like way of thinking leads to a Christ-like way of acting. It's a mindset that is willing to become a servant and to sacrifice for the good of others. This isn't just some abstract theory. It has profound, real-world implications. And that brings us to our final section. Because what we've just been describing, this radical humility, this incredible unity, it's all tied to one of Paul's absolute favorite concepts, the idea of a divine mystery that has now been revealed.
Check this out. 21. That's how many times the Apostle Paul uses the Greek word mysterion, or mystery. And pretty much every time he uses this word, he's pointing to something incredibly profound about God's plan, something that was once hidden, but is now being revealed through Christ.
He uses it to describe the gospel itself, to talk about the, at the time, shocking inclusion of non-Jews into God's family, the incredible reality of Christ in you, and the just sheer unfathomable depth of God's grace. The humility of Christ and the unity it creates, they're all part of this grand cosmic mystery of God's amazing redemptive plan.
And this brings us right back, full circle to where we started. That image of climbers on a mountain, bound together. You see, everything we've covered, from selfish ambition to the humility of Christ, it's not just theology, it is intensely practical. And it leaves all of us with a really critical question. If we are truly all roped together, whose footing are you responsible for holding today? You know, what if the single biggest threat to any group wasn't some enemy on the outside, but actually something brewing right inside it? Well, today, we're going to dive into the power of unity. And to kick things off, we've got a pretty shocking story that really shows why the lack of unity can be so absolutely devastating.
All right, so to really get our heads around just how crucial unity is, let's start with this short parable. It perfectly illustrates the incredible power of division.
So just imagine this scene for a second. You've got 100 dangerous inmates and only 3 guards watching over them. I mean, the math just doesn't add up, right? So naturally, the visitor asks the obvious question, but believe me, the answer he gets is anything but obvious.
And the reply? Wow. It's just so simple and so shocking. The guy just says, no, lunatics never unite. Now, obviously, that's some pretty stark language from another time, but the point it makes is just incredibly powerful. Think about it. Their inability to come together, to find any common ground, that was a stronger prison than any physical wall could ever be. And that one idea? That's really the key to everything we're talking about today.
Okay, so that story is the perfect setup. It shows us the very real cost of division. Let's break down exactly what a community loses out on when it just can't get on the same page.
And the source material on this is super direct. It doesn't pull any punches. Disunity isn't just, a minor disagreement or a little spat. No, it's framed as a terrible condition. It's like a disease, one that's actively threatening the health of the entire community from the inside out. I mean, the contrast here could not be more clear. On one side, you have disunity, which just leads to stagnation. The community basically withers on the vine, right? It forfeits all of its potential. But on the other side, you have unity. And that's the engine for growth. It's what fosters the health and the strength that allows a group to really truly thrive.
So, with stakes this high, it's probably no surprise that the source material we're looking at treats unity as way more than just a nice idea.
It's actually presented as a direct instruction, a command. And this is a really crucial shift in thinking. For the Apostle Paul, unity isn't just some helpful suggestion for better teamwork. He frames it as a core, non-negotiable requirement. It's an absolute must for the health of the whole community. It's an instruction, not just an option.
So, the command starts with this phrase, be like-minded. Now, I know what you might be thinking. That sounds like he's asking everyone to be a robot, to think the exact same way, but that's not it at all. The source actually defines this very differently.
And here's the practical application, which is brilliant. See, being like-minded isn't about everyone having the exact same thoughts. It's about everyone sharing the same mindset of active concern for each other. It means purposefully, intentionally looking out for the interests of others, not just focusing on your own.
Okay, so the command is clear, look out for others. But what does that actually look like in the real world? How do you do that? Well, the source doesn't just leave us with the instruction. It points us to a powerful, ultimate example to follow.
The ultimate model for this kind of selfless unity, according to the source, is Jesus. His entire life is basically framed as the blueprint, showing what it means to consistently and radically put the interests of others way ahead of your own.
The logic behind this selflessness gets broken down into 3 simple steps. First, you start with the example of Christ himself. Then, you look at his specific sacrifice. He became poor. And what was the point of that? Well, that's step 3. The outcome was so that you might become rich. It's a complete end-to-end model of self-sacrifice for the benefit of someone else.
So, the call to action for us then is to try and follow in those same footsteps. And it's a path that starts with humility. That humility then leads to obedience. And all of that culminates in the ultimate goal, living in true unity with one another.
All right, so let's recap. We've seen the parable about disunity, we've talked about the real cost of division, we've heard the command for unity, and we've looked at the ultimate example. So, the final step here is to turn all of this inward and really think about how these big ideas apply in our own lives.
And this brings us to the first big question the source material leaves us with. And it's a direct challenge, really. I mean, it's easy to nod along and agree with the idea, right? But what does it actually look like day to day? What are some of the small, practical ways we can actually prioritize someone else's interests over our own?
And that leads us to our final and maybe most provocative question. After everything we've gone through, why is unity among believers so important? Why does this matter so much? And even more to the point, what can we actually do to help build it? It's really a call to go from just understanding this stuff to actually doing something about it, leaving us all to think about what we personally can do to foster the kind of unity that's so essential.